My name's Tom, and I've been a security guard for almost 5 years now. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills and keeps me out of trouble. Most of my assignments are pretty routine: shopping malls, office buildings, the occasional factory, but this latest one was different. This time I was sent to an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town, and something about it didn't sit right with me. I got the call from my supervisor, Greg, early in the afternoon. He didn't say much, just that they needed someone to cover the night shift at this old hospital that had been shut down for years. It was the kind of place you hear about in ghost stories, the sort of building that people avoid even during the day. But work is work, and I wasn't about to turn it down. I couldn't help but feel a mix of curiosity and unease as I drove out there. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the countryside, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was heading into something I wasn't prepared for. But that's part of the job, I told myself. I'm here to keep people out and make sure nothing gets stolen or vandalized. Simple enough, right? When I finally pulled up to the hospital, it was exactly as creepy as I'd imagined. The place looked like it had been forgotten by time, with broken windows staring back at me like empty eye sockets. The paint was peeling off in long strips, revealing the bare concrete underneath, and weeds had taken over the parking lot. There was no sign of life, not even a stray cat or a bird. It was like the whole place was holding its breath. I checked in with Greg over the radio, letting him know I'd arrived. He gave me a few quick instructions: stick to the main hallways, avoid the basement unless absolutely necessary, and report anything unusual. "You'll be fine, Tom," he said, trying to sound reassuring. But I could hear the doubt in his voice. After a deep breath, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the car. The air was cool and still, with a faint smell of mold and decay. I made my way to the main entrance, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Inside, the hospital was even darker than outside, with only the dim light of my flashlight cutting through the gloom. I started my first patrol, moving slowly through the hallways. The floor was covered in dust, and every step stirred it up into the air, making it hard to breathe. The walls were lined with old medical posters and faded signs, their messages long forgotten. I couldn't help but wonder about the people who had worked here, the patients who had walked these halls. What had happened to them? Why had this place been abandoned so suddenly? As I walked, I tried to keep my mind focused on the task at hand. I checked the doors, making sure they were locked, and peered into the empty rooms. Everything was as it should be, quiet, empty, and lifeless. But the feeling of unease never left me. It was like the building was watching me, waiting for something. By the time I finished my first round, I was relieved to find nothing out of the ordinary. But the night was still young, and I knew there were hours to go before my shift was over. I took a deep breath and steeled myself for the long night ahead. This was just another job, I reminded myself. I'd get through it like I always did. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me in the shadows. As I started my patrol, the weight of the hospital's silence settled over me like a heavy blanket. The place was dead quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your own breathing sound too loud. My footsteps echoed down the dimly lit hallways, the light from my flashlight flickering off the cracked tiles and peeling walls. I kept my pace steady, trying not to let my imagination get the best of me. The hallways were lined with remnants of what must have once been a bustling hospital. Old gurneys were pushed up against the walls, their wheels rusted and locked in place. I passed by empty rooms with broken beds, their mattresses sagging and covered in dust. The walls were covered in faded warning signs: isolation area, sterile zone, radiation hazard. Most of the words were barely legible, the letters worn away by time and neglect. As I moved deeper into the building, I started to notice strange noises. At first, it was just the creaking of the floorboards under my feet, the kind of sound you'd expect in an old building like this. But then there were other noises, faint, almost imperceptible. A distant thud, like something heavy being dropped far away. A soft rustling, as if something was brushing against the walls. And every now and then, I'd feel a cold draft of air, chilling me to the bone. It didn't make sense. The windows were all sealed shut, and the doors were locked. But there it was, a cold breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. I tried to brush off the discomfort gnawing at me. Old buildings make noises. That's just how it is. Pipes creak, wood settles, the wind finds its way through cracks. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The more I explored, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The hospital seemed to close in around me, the shadows stretching out like grasping fingers. The air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew, a scent that seemed to cling to everything. My flashlight illuminated old medical equipment left behind, rusted IV stands, cracked plastic bins, even a few scattered syringes still lying on the floor. It was like everyone had just picked up and left in the middle of the day, leaving everything behind to rot. I kept moving, pushing through the discomfort, but my mind kept circling back to what Greg had said earlier. Avoid the basement unless absolutely necessary. I wasn't sure what it was about the basement that made him say that, but now I couldn't get it out of my head. It was as if knowing there was something down there made it impossible to ignore. I reached a stairwell at the far end of the corridor. The metal door leading to the basement was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it impenetrable. I shined my flashlight down the stairs, but the light barely seemed to reach the bottom. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to stay away, but my curiosity got the better of me. Taking a deep breath, I stepped through the door and began my descent. The temperature dropped with each step, the cold air wrapping around me like a shroud. The stairs creaked under my weight, and the sound of my footsteps echoed in the narrow stairwell. It felt like I was walking into the heart of the building, into a place where no light had touched in years. When I reached the bottom, the air was so cold that I could see my breath in front of me. The basement was even darker than the rest of the hospital, the shadows thicker, more oppressive. I swept my flashlight across the room, revealing rows of rusted metal shelves, most of them empty. A few old medical supplies were scattered here and there, bandages, glass bottles, some unidentifiable tools that looked more like instruments of torture than anything else. The basement was silent, but it wasn't the kind of silence I'd grown used to upstairs. This was different. It was heavy, expectant, like the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for something. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, my skin prickling with a sense of foreboding. I took a few more steps forward, the beam of my flashlight flickering slightly. My gut was screaming at me to turn around, to get out of there and never come back. But I forced myself to keep going. This was just another patrol, just another night on the job. But deep down, I knew that something about this place was different. And whatever it was waiting for me in the dark. As I descended into the basement, the air grew colder and the darkness thickened around me. Every step echoed with the sound of dripping water and my own footsteps. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise in the distance. Turning a corner, my flashlight caught a glimpse of a terrifying creature with pale skin and glowing eyes. I froze in fear until it lunged at me, grabbing my leg with an icy iron grip. I managed to break free and bolted upstairs, fear driving me away from the basement as fast as I could go. The basement was a nightmare, filled with the frantic rhythm of my breathing and the low, guttural growls of the creature. My leg was in its icy, unyielding grip, and every moment felt like an eternity. I kicked and thrashed with all my might, adrenaline surging through me, but the creature's hold was terrifyingly strong. My fear escalated into sheer terror as I realized how effortlessly it restrained me, and the thought of not making it out alive began to sink in. The creature's touch was a cold, unnatural agony, sending relentless chills through my entire body. I could feel its foul, rancid breath against my skin, a stench so vile it made me gag. Each breath it took seemed to linger, suffocating me with its presence. Desperation drove me to summon every ounce of strength I had left. With a final, desperate kick, I aimed for the creature's face. My foot connected with a sickening thud, and it let out a howl of pain. For a brief moment, its grip loosened. Seizing the opportunity, I wrenched my leg free and scrambled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature was still in the shadows, its eyes glowing with fury, but I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I turned and ran, my legs pumping as fast as they would go, the basement's oppressive darkness chasing me every step of the way. My heart raced as I bolted through the basement, every muscle in my body fueled by sheer adrenaline. The creature's growls echoed behind me, a chilling reminder of the danger that lurked just inches away. The narrow stairwell seemed endless as I scrambled up the steps, each one creaking ominously under my frantic pace. The sound of the creature's claws scraping against the walls grew louder, a sinister symphony of pursuit. The air was thick with dread, making each breath feel heavy and labored. The pounding of my own heart was deafening, its rhythm a constant reminder of how close I was to being caught. My mind was singularly focused on escape, the fear driving me to run faster than I ever thought possible. I didn't dare look back, the terror of what I might see propelling me upward. When I finally reached the top of the stairs, I threw myself at the door, bursting into the corridor with a gasp of relief. I slammed the door shut behind me, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. The sound of the creature's angry roars was muffled, but not gone. With a final, frantic twist, I locked the door and backed away, my back pressing against the cold, hard wall. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I fought to steady my racing heart, knowing that I had only bought myself a moment's respite. I stumbled into my apartment, every step feeling like an ordeal. The encounter in the basement replayed in my mind like a relentless nightmare. I tried to convince myself it was all a bad dream, a product of my imagination, but the bruises on my leg told a different story. They throbbed with a pain that was all too real, a constant reminder of what had happened. The apartment was eerily silent, the kind of silence that makes you feel like something is lurking just out of sight. The darkness of the room seemed to press in on me, suffocating and heavy. I could almost feel the presence of the creature, as if it was waiting just beyond the edges of my vision. The dread that had followed me from the basement settled over me like a shroud, making it impossible to relax or find any comfort. Sleep was elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes staring back at me, heard the creature's growls echoing in my ears. I couldn't escape the memory, no matter how hard I tried. In a desperate attempt to make sense of it all, I sat down to write about what had happened. I hoped that putting it into words might help me process the terror, but as I wrote, the memory only became more vivid. The details of the encounter were etched into my mind with a clarity that made the fear all the more intense. The sound of my own pen scratching across the paper seemed to amplify the silence around me, each word dragging me deeper into the darkness of that basement. I was trapped in a cycle of fear and remembrance, unable to escape the terror that had so suddenly invaded my life. The next morning, I was a wreck. Exhaustion had settled over me like a heavy blanket, and the terror of the previous night refused to fade. Every creak in my apartment seemed amplified, each shadow a reminder of what I had seen. I tried to focus on my routine, but the fear still gripped me, making every mundane task feel monumental. When my supervisor called to check in, I felt a wave of dread. He asked how the night went, and I hesitated, my mind racing. How could I possibly explain what had happened? The memory of the creature, its glowing eyes and cold grip, made it hard to form coherent thoughts. My hands trembled as I struggled to find the right words. Finally, I made a decision. I told him I was resigning. The relief that followed was immediate, like a weight being lifted off my shoulders. I knew I couldn't return to that hospital, to the basement where the nightmare had unfolded. As I hung up the phone, a sense of unease lingered. Despite quitting, the fear remained. I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still lurking somewhere in the shadows, waiting for its next chance to strike. The decision to leave had brought a measure of peace, but it hadn't erased the terror that had changed my life forever. My apartment, once a refuge, had become a place of relentless fear. Night after night, the same nightmares plagued me, each one more vivid than the last. The creature from the basement was always there, its glowing eyes fixated on me, its presence suffocating. I would wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, the terror still clinging to me as though the creature had followed me back from my dreams. The nightmares were horrifyingly detailed. I would find myself back in the basement, the air thick with dread, as the creature pursued me with a relentless, predatory speed. I could feel its cold, clammy touch and hear its guttural growls echoing in the confined space. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I was trapped, unable to escape its clutches. Every night, The sense of impending doom felt as real as if I were actually back in that basement, and I would jolt awake, my body trembling with fear. The fear began to seep into my waking hours. I became paranoid, avoiding sleep as much as possible and refusing to leave my apartment after dark. Every creak of the building, every shadow in my peripheral vision felt like a sign of the creature's return. My world shrank to the confines of my apartment, where I felt safe but increasingly isolated. Desperate for answers, I started researching the hospital and its history. I scoured old records and online forums, hoping to find some explanation for the horrors I'd encountered. I needed to understand if there was a history of similar occurrences, or if I was simply losing my mind. The more I dug, the more I hoped to find something that could offer an explanation or, at the very least, a sense of closure. But deep down, I feared that understanding the hospital's past might only make the nightmares more real. My apartment had become a chaotic labyrinth of stacks of books and papers. I was drowning in research about the hospital and paranormal occurrences, hoping to find some definitive answers that might explain the nightmare I'd lived through. Yet, despite my tireless efforts, I could only uncover vague references and murky accounts of strange happenings at the hospital. Nothing concrete, nothing that could make sense of what I had encountered. The more I delved into the murky past of that place, the more I realized that some things might never be understood. The fear that had gripped me remained a permanent part of my life, an unwelcome companion that shadowed my every move. The creature's memory clung to me like a dark stain, haunting my thoughts even in the daylight. Reflecting on the experience, I recognized how profoundly it had changed me. I had become more cautious, more wary of the unknown. Where once I had been curious and adventurous, now I approached the world with a deep-seated mistrust. The basement, the creature, and those nightmares had shattered a part of me that I wasn't sure I could ever reclaim. As I sat amidst the clutter of my research, I came to terms with the fact that I might never escape the memory of that creature. The unanswered questions and the lingering sense of dread were now a part of my reality. I had ventured into the depths of fear and had come out on the other side with a story that felt unfinished, a tale with more questions than answers. The shadows of my past were a constant reminder that some mysteries are better left unexplored.